of reach of the majority of the world's population due to lending policies that are risk-averse and carry onerous costs as well as conditionalities.
Barely 24 hours after Ramaphosa's address, South Africa, France, and Germany have announced the signing of loan agreements for the two European nations to each extend 300 million euros in concessional financing to South Africa to support the country's efforts to reduce its reliance on coal. Earlier in the week, wealthy nations endorsed a $98 billion investment plan put forward by South Africa for the country's energy transition. According to the World Bank, South Africa will require a large sum of $500 billion to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The agreement comes as developing countries and emerging economies place pressure on wealthier nations to step up their efforts for climate action. Laila Johnson-Salami, Arise News.
And Laila Salami Johnson, Arise Environment correspondent, is live here in the studios. It's been your week at the COP27.
A busy week indeed, Mr. Boson.
A very busy week. And give me a breakdown of that 600 million euros for South Africa to support. Yes, South Africa is the biggest emitter on the continent, so it is suspected that perhaps the biggest flow of money will flow towards Pretoria.
Absolutely. South Africa is the 12th largest emitter in the world, the largest emitter on the African continent. 80% of its energy still comes from coal. So yes, a lot of support is needed. And South Africa has been trying to rally support for a long time. And the country has had pledges here and there and commitments have been made. But this does seem like one of the largest commitments so far. France and Germany coming forward, each are going to provide 300 million euros to South Africa. That's a total of 600 million euros or $603 million in total. So it's great news for South Africa and for their energy transition. It's in line with what the country is trying to do, and it certainly provides support. I would say this is definitely what Ramaphosa would have been going to COP hoping to get out of the summit this year.
And he went with a very big team, by the way. Mm-hmm. And they've gone with what they call the Just Energy Transition Plan of their own,
yes.
Which I think he laid out at the meeting, and I think everybody had to look into it and buy into that.
Absolutely.
So in terms of walking the talk, do you think South Africa is walking the talk, as it were?
I would say South Africa is trying the same way that most African nations are really trying to find the best way around this solution. Of course, South Africa is in a unique position on the continent compared to other countries based on the amounts of emissions that are coming out of South Africa. But progress is definitely being made. And when you see commitments coming forward like this, it's good news. But Mr. Boson, this has to translate into action itself. It can't just be based on commitments coming forward at COP27. It has to also be a reality. So that's something I will definitely be following over the next few months.
You like to see what happens on a day-to-day basis
rather than just how the funds are spent as well. Exactly, how the funds are spent as well. These are all of the important intricacies here and there when it comes to climate finance that we have to be aware of.
So we've got an Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa launched today by the African Union, by the FDB and other partners. Tell me about that.
Absolutely. Great news for Africa. The AFDB, AU and partners launched the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa to scale and speed up financing for green infrastructure on the continent and close the infrastructure gap. So the plan is to speed up the scale that's needed to transition to net zero in Africa. And the focus is to develop low-carbon climate resilient infrastructure. So the president of the Africa Development Bank, Dr. Akiwumi Adesina, gave an address today at the event, and it's Finance Day today as well at COP27. And just to touch on a few things that he said, Dr. Adesina said that, there we go, it's right up there on the screen, Africa needs infrastructure financing of $130 to $170 billion a year, with an infrastructure finance gap of $108 billion a year. He also went on to say that out of the 522 billion that's been on green bonds between 2007 and 2018, and this is very shocking, Africa accounted for just 2 billion. Now that's 0.4%. That's how little has come to Africa. And last year, 623 billion green bonds were issued globally, Mr. Boasen, and Africa's share, by the way, of that was just 0.26%, the lowest share of any region in the world. So by focusing on green infrastructure, Adesina says that Africa can increase the share of green bonds that it accounts for. And the hope is to roughly reach 2.5% globally. So the expectation is to crowd in at least 14 billion in green financing. Now, how can this be done? And what exactly is the AFDB looking for? From converting heavy fuel and diesel plants to gas hybrid, to green non-power infrastructure in Africa like transport systems, to capturing flared gas and converting to LPG that we need for cooking, to the development of green hydrogen as well. These are all of the things that the AFDB, the AU and partners are going to be looking for support for. So to start off, the AFDB announced that they will be raising $500 million in terms of project preparation and development, and that would then be used to mobilize $10 billion in investments in green infrastructure. So that's what we have coming out of Finance Day at COP27 today. Good news.
It's very important because I'm speaking to a guest tonight on Alliance Exchange, talking about green bonds and how the capital market can come into play. Because if you look at the size of green bonds, for example, in Nigeria, you've got just about one or two that we've got on the ground. The Minister of Environment came a few years ago to the exchange. They did a very small patch of size of bond. Then you've got Access Bank also put up something a little bit small. But again, if you go outside Nigeria, with the exception of South Africa and perhaps one other market, you don't see much of green bonds listed. So you need a market that can help you raise bond and debt that we can actually leverage very quickly. Because we're talking about climate funding. It's not a 6 months, 1 year, 6 year project.
Exactly. It's definitely not. This is a decades long thing. And, you know, Dr. Adesina said something else that I'd like to mention. He said that globally you have $103 trillion of assets under management. If we are able to get just 0.03 or 0.04% of that,
where the money
there we go.
The PFAs, the venture capitals, the equity funds, and others. Those of guys sitting on very serious assets under management, globally speaking, the money is sitting there,
and it can close the infrastructure financing gap.
Yeah, it can just do a whole lot for us in Africa. For example, look at Nigeria. We're talking about 40 trillion in pension funds. So how do we unlock that? Do we need to change legislation to be able to get more of the PFAs and insurance funds from where they're just sitting down and use them and tap them to invest in green bonds and debt specialized instruments? But that's a whole lot of conversation on finance, by the way. But what's the impact of climate change on African economies' GDP, by the way? Because it all comes down to the bottom line.
Well, another shocking report came out this morning at COP27. African countries face economic devastation, it says, from climate change. This is coming through an aid agency called Christian Aid. And we have a graph that shows what they're trying to depict right up there on the screen, giving you 3 possible scenarios and what Africa's GDP is going to look like under each scenario. So the world is on track at the moment for 2.7 degrees of global warming by the end of the century. And the report is saying that African countries face an average 20% hit to their expected GDP by 2050. But Mr. Boasen, what I find shocking about this report is that if you look at that graph closely, in every single scenario, Africa is still negatively impacted no matter what, because the world has already warmed. So we can only try and reduce the effects that may come. But even there, with current policies, it says, and then it goes into a scenario, and then a final scenario, which I believe is based on the Paris agreements of 1.5, exactly, above pre-industrial levels. Africa is still in a negative position there. So
2050 to 2100 years. That's at the extreme right.
Exactly, 2050 to 2100. So the second half of this century, that's how much GDP is, the science says, Africa is likely to lose African countries.
Between 2050 to 2100, we're looking at coming away from green, but we're still from red, I beg your pardon. We haven't really turned green, we're just going to be turning orange.
Exactly, going orange. So somewhere in the middle, nothing great, a bit of an improvement, but nothing great. So
for the next 100 years,
Pretty much. So if we're looking ahead to the end of the century now, so it's not great news, and this is why Finance Day is such an important day. How can we unlock funds to prepare for what climate change has in store and to act to what we're seeing climate change doing already today? So it's great to see the Africa Development Bank, the AU, etc., coming forward with these huge alliances that have the potential to do great things for Africa and to protect Africa. So if you add
this to the Africa's Carbon Markets Initiative of yesterday, the ACMI, you think we're punching our weight at this particular event, which is Africa's first ever climate conference?
Certainly, we certainly are. Even today, Dr. Adesina actually spoke on local carbon markets and called for the development of local carbon markets. So you can see that there's a lot of focus on how we can maximize the potential of carbon markets, and a lot of initiatives are sort of tying in around that. So I would say that a lot of the stress and the reaction that we're seeing that's coming with what some may see as proactiveness, others may see as soft agreements. But what we're seeing here is certainly a reaction to the impacts of climate change, particularly over the past year, that everybody in the world has felt.
On a final note, and I've been reading through over the last 2-3 days, this is South Africa getting 600 million euros. I've seen on the line Kenya through President William Ruto says they've gotten about 3.5 trillion shillings in energy, in climate financing deals at this conference. So I'm beginning to ask myself, I haven't seen a show of hand for Nigeria team and say, look, this is how much we've gotten so far. So South Africa is getting 600 million on the table. So Kenya has got about 3.5 trillion shillings. So I'm asking for Nigeria, and I want you to keep an eye out on that for me.
That's exactly what we're looking for. What is Nigeria going to walk out of COP27 with?
What we're going to get.
Exactly.
We're going to come back home
what we're going to come back home with. It's extremely important. We have to continue to focus on that and see what developments come out of that. But of course, when we have developments from the AU, the AFDB, they automatically tie into Nigeria as well. So the ACMI is relative to Nigeria.
But it looks like everybody's out there for himself.
Exactly. That's what it seems like. Nigeria needs to really get forward and chase that money, especially for our energy transition plan. You know, we're still looking for that initial $10 billion. And that's one thing that negotiators and the delegation at COP are going to be pushing for. How can we raise money for our energy transition plan? So in a few days' time, I mean, it would be great for us to hear that Nigeria's energy transition plan is being supported with XYZ by so-and-so
I want some money on the table. That's why I'm putting on my green today.
I put mine on yesterday.
Oh, yeah. Yes, yesterday. And you're on orange today.
I'm on orange today.
So it's okay. It's good. Let's see the money on the table. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
it's good
Mr.
to have
Wilson.
you around. Laila Salami Johnson, Arise environment correspondent, digging all into the top stories at COP.